The Frozen Silence, a saga of fire and ice. The German soldiers called them Nachthexen, night witches. They flew plywood biplanes that should have been in a museum, not a dogfight. They flew without parachutes, without radios, and without fear. But in the winter of 1942, one pilot discovered that the Nazis weren't just fighting for territory in the East. They were digging for a power that predated humanity. This is the story of the secret war beneath the ice, a story the Cold War tried to bury forever. Chapter 1: The Wooden Coffin. The cockpit of the Polikarpov P-2 felt like a splintered crate held together by spit and prayer. Nina Petrova adjusted her goggles, the leather straps stiff with frost. At 4,000 feet above the Russian steppe, the air didn't just freeze your skin, it tried to shatter your bones. Engine status? Nina shouted over the rhythmic thrum of the 100-horsepower motor. In the rear seat, her navigator, Galina, leaned forward, her face a mask of grease and determination. Oil pressure is dropping. The fuel lines are icing over, Nina. If we don't drop the payload in 10 minutes, we're a flying fireball. Nina looked down. Below lay the German 12th Panzer Division, a sprawling steel beast carved into the white flesh of the motherland. To the Germans, Nina was a ghost. To the Soviet High Command, she was expendable. Cutting the throttle, Nina commanded. She reached for the lever and pulled. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Silence rushed in, a terrifying, hollow vacuum. This was the Night Witch's signature move. By cutting their engines and gliding toward the target, they became invisible to the German acoustic locators. The only sound was the eerie hiss of the wind through the wire stays of the wings. Whoosh! Whoosh! Like the sound of a broomstick. Steady! Galina whispered, her eyes glued to the primitive bomb sight. Left 5 degrees. Hold! Hold! Suddenly, a searchlight snapped to life. A finger of blinding white light stabbed the sky, missing their wing by mere inches. Nina didn't flinch. She couldn't. Release! The plane jolted upward as 2 100-kilogram bombs fell away. Seconds later, the earth screamed. A fountain of orange flame tore through the German encampment. But as the fire illuminated the ground, Nina saw it, something that didn't belong in a war zone. In the center of the crater, the blast had peeled away the permafrost to reveal a structure made of iridescent black stone. It wasn't a bunker. It was a spire, covered in glowing geometric symbols that hummed with a low-frequency vibration Nina could feel in her teeth. Nina, look! Galina pointed. Around the spire, German SS officers weren't running for cover. They were kneeling. They were waiting for it to wake up. Chapter 2: The Man from the OSS. Washington, D.C., 3 weeks later. Elias Thorne pushed his hat back and stared at the grainy reconnaissance photo on the mahogany desk. As a former professor of Norse antiquities turned OSS operative, he'd seen his share of Nazi weirdness. But this was different. The Soviets are calling it Project Malnia, the general said, puffing on a cigar that smelled like expensive treason. But our spies in Berlin call it the Black Sun. They've found something in the Arctic, Thorne. Something that's messing with every compass from Moscow to London. Elias leaned in, tracing the symbols on the black spire with a calloused finger. These aren't runes, General. This is pre-Sumerian. If the Nazis figure out how to harness the magnetic output of this site, they won't need V-2 rockets. They'll be able to pull every Allied plane out of the sky by simply flipping a switch. We're sending you in, the general said. We have a tenuous agreement with a Soviet female bomber regiment nearby. They provide the transport, you provide the expertise. You leave for the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap tonight. A bomber regiment? Elias smirked. Who's the pilot? A girl named Petrova. They say she's the best they've got. They also say she's seen the spire up close and lived to tell about it. Chapter 3: The Edge of the World. The rendezvous point was a windswept plateau in the Arctic Circle. Elias Thorne stepped off the transport plane into a wall of white. Through the swirling snow, he saw it, a small, fragile biplane idling on the ice. Standing beside it was a woman who looked too young to have seen the end of the world. Her flight suit was oversized, her face smeared with engine soot, but her eyes, ice blue and razor sharp, told a different story. "You are the American?" Nina asked, her English clipped and cold. "I'm the guy who's going to make sure we don't all blow up," Elias replied, hauling his gear toward the plane. Nina looked at his heavy crates of equipment, then at her flimsy wooden aircraft. "My plane is made of wood and fabric, Mr. Thorne. It does not like heavy American secrets. If we fly into the magnetic storm, the wood will hold, but your heart might stop. Are you ready for that?" Elias looked north, where the aurora borealis was dancing in unnatural shades of violet and crimson. "I've spent my life looking for the truth, Petrova. I'm not stopping because of a little static." "Then get in," she said, climbing into the cockpit. "Tonight, we fly where the maps end." The Iron Labyrinth. The crash landing had been a controlled catastrophe, a symphony of ripping canvas and groaning wood. Nina had somehow kept the fragile P-2 from disintegrating entirely, skidding across the ice and wedging the biplane between two towering shards of black, crystalline rock. Elias Thorne, his head throbbing, crawled out of the wreckage, his antique rifle clutched tight. "Everyone all right?" he yelled over the howling wind. Galena, the navigator, gave a dazed thumbs up, spitting out a mouthful of snow. Nina, already on her feet, was inspecting the spire that pierced the sky like an alien lightning rod. "The compasses are still dead," Nina reported, tapping the useless gauge on her wrist. "And that humming, it's getting stronger. The Germans are close." Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to rumble. A massive, circular section of ice and rock slid away, revealing a gaping maw in the earth, a tunnel entrance framed by immense, interlocking iron gears that ground together with the sound of grinding teeth. Swastika banners, emblazoned with a black sun symbol, hung from the rock face. "The entrance to Thule," Elias whispered, his historians all battling the soldiers' dread. "They found it." A squad of SS soldiers in specialized Arctic gear emerged from the tunnel, their MP-40 machine guns raised. Leading them was a gaunt, scar-faced officer with a monocle, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Standartenführer Richter," Nina cursed under her breath. "They call him the architect of ice. He's obsessed with the occult." A firefight erupted. Nina, despite her exhaustion, moved with a fluidity that belied her small frame. She emptied her Nagant revolver with deadly accuracy, dropping two soldiers before diving for cover behind a shattered wing strut. Elias, using his knowledge of the ancient structures, found weak points in the iron archway and planted small satchels of dynamite. "We have to get inside," Elias roared. "If they seal that gate, we're finished." They fought their way to the entrance. Elias detonated the explosives, blowing a gap in the iron gears. As they scrambled through the smoking breach, Richter's voice echoed after them. "You will not stop us, little witch! The black sun rises tonight." Inside, the air was warmer, unnaturally so, and the blue, pulsing light from the spire overhead filtered down, creating long, dancing shadows. The tunnel was not natural. It was a vast, subterranean city carved into the ice, connected by walkways of black, polished stone and glowing conduits. Strange, geometric carvings covered every surface. "This is impossible," Elias breathed, touching a warm, metallic pillar. "This technology is thousands of years ahead of anything on Earth." They followed the main passage into a massive, cavernous chamber. Below them, a dizzying array of gears, pistons, and glowing crystal matrices spun around a colossal, humming orb of blue energy at the very center. It was a machine the size of a mountain, its heart beating with a pulsing, magnetic rhythm. And working at the controls, under the watchful eyes of SS guards, were hundreds of emaciated figures, slave laborers in tattered uniforms. As Nina's eyes scanned the crowd, her breath hitched. She recognized a face. A small, frightened woman with a faded scarf over her hair. "Galena!" Nina whispered. Not her navigator, but another Galena, her closest friend from the Night Witch's training camp, thought to be dead for months. Galena looked up, her eyes wide with terror, then she subtly shook her head, a desperate, silent warning to Nina. At the main console, Standartenführer Richter raised his arms, silhouetted against the glowing orb. He pressed a large, ornate lever, and the entire structure vibrated, the blue light intensifying until the air crackled with energy. "The world engine is online!" Richter's voice boomed through the chamber. "Soon, the magnetic poles will shift, and the Third Reich will be the master of all creation." Suddenly, a voice echoed from above. "Stop them!" High in the rafters of the cavern, another group of figures emerged. More women in tattered Soviet uniforms, the rest of Nina's regiment. They had survived, making their way here through tunnels only they knew. They began firing at the SS guards, creating chaos. In the confusion, Nina saw her chance. "Galina, the console! Destabilize the power flow!" Her friend understood. As SS soldiers fired, Galina lunged for the console, pulling a series of wires and throwing switches with desperate speed. Sparks flew, and the massive blue orb began to flicker erratically. Richter, seeing his plan unravel, aimed his pistol at Galina. "You fool! You'll destroy us all!" Before he could fire, Elias tackled him, sending the two men sprawling onto a walkway high above the main chamber. Nina, seeing her friend in danger, started to climb the treacherous, ice-slicked scaffolding. She had to reach Galina. She had to stop the world engine before it tore the planet apart. But in the chaos, she saw something else. Her own commander, Colonel Volkov, emerging from a hidden passage. He wasn't aiming his weapon at the Germans. He was aiming at Galina. The true betrayal had begun. The blood of the motherland. The air inside the world engine's chamber had turned into a thick, ionized soup. Every hair on Nina's arm stood on end, and the taste of ozone, sharp and metallic, coated her tongue. Below, the great blue orb hummed at a frequency that made the very bones of the cavern groan. "Galina, get down!" Nina screamed, but her voice was lost in the roar of sparking machinery. High above on the gantry, Colonel Volkov stood like a statue carved from Siberian ice. His Soviet uniform, usually a symbol of pride, now looked like a shroud. He didn't look like a hero of the Union. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and decided to move in. "The Union cannot control this power, Nina!" Volkov shouted, his pistol leveled at Galina's back. "And the Americans will only use it to chain us. But if I give it to Richter, we buy our safety. We buy a seat at the table of the new world." Nina's heart shattered. Volkov had been the one who taught them that the P-2 biplanes were invisible, because of the pilot's spirit, not the wood. Now, that spirit was being traded for a Nazi promise. "Traitor!" Nina roared. She lunged. Not toward Volkov, but toward a frayed steel cable hanging from a crane used to move the ancient stones. She swung out over the abyss, the blue light of the engine swirling beneath her boots like a hungry ocean. Crack! Volkov fired. The bullet grazed Nina's shoulder, tearing through her flight jacket and drawing a line of fire across her skin. She didn't let go. Using the momentum, she kicked off a cooling pipe and collided with Volkov just as he was about to fire again. They crashed onto the metal grating. The pistol skittered across the floor, falling through the gaps into the blue void below. "You're a child, Petrova!" Volkov hissed, pinning her down with his superior weight. "You're fighting for a world that's already dead. I'm fighting for the girls you sent to die." Nina spat, slamming her forehead into his nose. Below them, the battle reached a fever pitch. Elias Thorne was locked in a brutal struggle with Standartenführer Richter near the primary cooling vent. Elias was younger and stronger, but Richter fought with the desperation of a true believer. "You see the symbols, American?" Richter laughed, his face bloody. "They aren't runes. They are coordinates. This machine isn't just a weapon, it's a map to the stars." Richter pulled a hidden dagger and lunged. Elias caught his wrist, the blade inches from his throat. With a roar of effort, Elias twisted Richter's arm, forcing him back toward the edge of the cooling vent. "Then go see them for yourself," Elias yelled, shoving Richter into the dark, freezing intake of the Arctic waters that cooled the engine. The Nazi officer vanished with a scream that was quickly muffled by the rushing torrent. But the machine was now out of control. Without Richter's precise input, the magnetic core began to oscillate. The iridescent black stone of the chamber started to crack. Nina! Elias looked up, seeing her struggling with Volkov. Galina had reached the emergency release valve. Nina! It's going to blow! We have to vent the magnetic pressure or the entire North Pole will collapse. Volkov, seeing his leverage gone, scrambled toward the exit. You're all ghosts! He screamed before disappearing into the dark tunnels. Nina didn't chase him. She ran to Galina. Together, they grabbed the massive iron wheel of the release valve. It was frozen shut with decades of rime ice. Elias! Help us! Nina cried out. Elias sprinted up the stairs, his boots clanging on the metal. He threw his weight into the wheel alongside the two women. The three of them, a Russian pilot, a Soviet slave, and an American spy, strained against the weight of an ancient world. Creak! The wheel turned an inch. Then another. With a deafening hiss, a plume of white-blue energy erupted from the safety vents, shooting straight up through the spire and into the Arctic sky. The aurora borealis outside turned a blinding, pure white, visible for 1,000 miles in every direction. The shaking stopped. The blue orb dimmed to a soft, pulsing violet. The engine was dormant. Silence fell over the cavern, broken only by the heavy breathing of the survivors. The remaining night witches began to climb down from the rafters, their faces pale but their eyes bright with victory. Elias leaned against the railing, looking at the sleeping machine. We stopped it. But we can't stay here. The Germans will send reinforcements, and Volkov is still out there. Nina looked at Galina, then at her sisters in arms. They had survived the Nazis and the ice, but they had just started a secret war that would last for decades. We take what we can, Nina said, her voice turning to steel. And then we burn this place to the ground. No one, not Moscow, not Washington, gets to play God with this. The silent assent. The facility was dying. The world engine, now vented and unstable, began to hum a low, funeral dirge. The iridescent black stone of the cavern walls started to flake off in razor-sharp shards as the magnetic fields collapsed. The structural integrity is tied to the energy output, Elias shouted, checking his watch. The moment the core cools, the ice above us is going to reclaim this place. We have 20 minutes before the North Pole becomes a graveyard. Nina looked at her surviving sisters. 12 women, hollow-cheeked and scarred by months of Nazi captivity, stood among the machinery. They weren't just pilots anymore. They were ghosts who had clawed their way back from the underworld. Galina! Nina turned to her navigator. Can you lead them out through the ventilation shafts? The main tunnels will be crawling with Richter's reinforcements. Galina grabbed Nina's arm. Not without you, Nina. We fly together. There's only one plane left that can reach the extraction point, Nina said, looking toward the hangar platform where a captured German Arado AR-196 sat, a sleek, metal seaplane that was the polar opposite of her wooden P-2. And it only seats 2. I have to stay and make sure the demolition charges blow. If this tech survives, the war will never end. It will just change colors. Elias stepped forward, his face grim. I'm staying. I know the wiring of these ancient conduits. You take the girls and get to the surface. No, Nina said, her voice dropping to a whisper. You have the documents, Elias. You have the proof of what Volkov and the OSS were planning. If you die here, the truth dies. You're the only one who can tell the world that we weren't just witches, we were soldiers. The choice was a jagged blade. In the distance, the sound of boots on metal echoed. The German reinforcements were coming. The breakout. Nina pushed Galina toward the shafts. Go! That's an order! With a tearful salute, the women vanished into the darkness of the service ducts. Now, it was just Nina and Elias in the heart of the humming mountain. You're a stubborn woman, Petrova, Elias said, his hands moving fast as he wired the last of the stolen German TNT to the magnetic core. And you're a terrible spy, Thorn. You care too much, she retorted, her eyes scanning the gantry. Suddenly, a shadow moved above. Volkov had it left. He was perched on a crane, his face a mask of madness. He didn't fire at them, he fired at the TNT. Snap! A bullet sparked off a metal casing. If I can't have the future, no one can! Volkov screamed. Nina didn't think. She sprinted toward the Arado seaplane, the engine already idling as Elias had primed it. She vaulted into the cockpit and gripped the controls. The German plane was heavy, powerful, and alien. Elias, get in! Now! Elias dove into the observer's seat just as Volkov leveled his rifle for a killing shot. Nina slammed the throttle forward. The Arado roared to life, its prop wash blowing Volkov backward into the glowing violet mist of the core. The plane didn't have a runway. It had a narrow, sloping tunnel of ice that led toward the surface. Nina, we aren't going to clear the ceiling! Elias yelled. Hold your breath, she replied. She remembered the lessons from the P2, the silent glide. She waited until the very last second, then she cut the engine. The silence returned. The plane, suddenly lighter without the torque of the engine, lifted its nose. She used the rising heat from the dying engine below to catch a thermal. The Arado skimmed the ceiling of the tunnel, the wings scraping against the ice with a sound like 1,000 knives on glass. The white void. They burst out of the mountainside just as the charges detonated. Behind them, the earth seemed to swallow itself. The spire collapsed in a silent, magnificent plume of blue dust. The mountain groaned and sank, the ice folding over the ancient secrets, like a white shroud. Nina leveled the plane out over the frozen Arctic Ocean. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, the first time they had seen it in weeks. We made it, Elias breathed, looking back at the smoking ruins. Nina didn't answer. She was looking at the fuel gauge. The Arado was leaking. They had enough to reach the Greenland coast, but not enough to disappear. Elias, Nina said softly. When we land, they're going to be waiting. Your people and mine. We can tell them we found nothing, Elias suggested. We can tell them it all blew up. They'll know we're lying. You have the files in your pocket. I have the memory of the code in my head. She looked at him, the American who had become her only true ally in a world of shifting borders. In the world that's coming, Nina said, there is no room for people like us. We know too much. As the Greenland coastline appeared, so did the silhouettes of two fleets. To the east, Soviet destroyers. To the west, American carriers. They were already moving into position, not to rescue them, but to claim them. Nina gripped the stick. Elias, do you trust me? With my life, which? Then we're not landing for either of them. She banked the plane northwest, heading toward the most desolate stretch of the ice cap, where the radar couldn't reach. They would disappear into the frost, becoming a legend that both superpowers would spend the next 50 years trying to solve. The Ghost Radius. The Arado AR-196 groaned as Nina pushed it through a thick wall of freezing fog. The fuel needle was bouncing off the red, empty peg. Below them, the Greenland ice sheet was a jagged, unforgiving sea of white, broken only by deep blue crevasses that looked like wounds in the earth. Nina, radar pips! Elias shouted, leaning over his shoulder to check the primitive scanner. 2 contacts coming from the west, Mustangs. And 3 from the east, Yakovlevs. They've picked us up. The superpowers were closing in. To the Americans, Elias was a hero who had gone rogue with classified data. To the Soviets, Nina was a traitor who had stolen a Nazi miracle. Neither side wanted them alive if they couldn't be controlled. They won't fire yet, Nina said, her eyes squinting against the glare of the snow. They both want the plane intact. They think the Black Sun tech is inside. Is it? Elias asked. Nina reached into her flight suit and pulled out a small, pulsing violet crystal she had snatched from the core before it blew. It hummed against her palm, a tiny piece of a sun that had died eons ago. Only enough to prove we weren't dreaming. The dead zone. Nina saw what she was looking for, the Cermak-Kujalek Glacier. It was a chaotic mess of ice towers and deep canyons. If she could get below the rim, the radar would lose them in the Ground clutter. Hang on! She yelled. She kicked the rudder, sending the seaplane into a sickening side slip. The American Mustangs roared overhead, their silver wings gleaming. A second later, the Soviet Yaks dived from the clouds, tracers stitching the air where Nina had been a moment before. The two allies were already firing at each other, a skirmish of the Cold War beginning before the hot one had even ended. Nina dived into a canyon of ice. The wingtips cleared the walls by less than a meter. The engine gave one final, violent shudder and died. Elias! Out! Now! The plane skidded across a frozen meltwater lake, its floats shearing off with the sound of a freight train hitting a wall of glass. The fuselage spun, slamming into a soft snowbank at the base of a massive cliff. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. The manhunts begin. Elias kicked the cockpit canopy open. He pulled Nina from the wreckage just as the smell of fuel began to rise. They scrambled into a nearby ice cave, a natural cathedral of translucent blue. High above, they heard the roar of the search planes. They stayed for hours, circling like vultures, but the blizzard began to move in, masking the crash site in a swirl of white chaos. They'll send ground teams, Elias whispered, his breath hitching. He opened his satchel and looked at the files, the blueprints of the world engine and the names of the men in Washington and Moscow who had funded the occult research. We can't keep this, Nina. As long as we have this, we are targets. Nina took the violet crystal and held it up. The light from the cave's entrance caught it, casting strange, geometric shadows on the ice walls. We are already targets, Elias. But we have something they don't. What's that? We are dead on their maps, she said, a small, grim smile touching her lips. To the world, Nina Petrova and Elias Thorne died in a dogfight over the Arctic. We are the ghosts now. Elias looked at her, really looked at her. The soot, the blood, the defiance. He took her hand. The ghost radius. It's a big world, Nina. Where do we go first? West, she said. Across the ice. I know a place where the Inuit hunters hide from the wind. They don't care about world engines or emperors. They only care about the stars. The first step. They burn the files in a small, controlled fire inside the cave, using the Arados manual for kindling. The secrets that could have ended the world turned into gray ash and drifted away on the Arctic wind. As they stepped out of the cave, the blizzard hit full force. They tied themselves together with a length of parachute cord, one pilot, one scholar, and disappeared into the white void. Back in Washington, a file was placed on a desk. It was marked, Project Silence. In Moscow, a similar folder was stamped, Kolik, the Witch. Both files remained open for the next 40 years. The Whisper in the Whiskey. Nome, Alaska, 6 months later. The wind in Nome didn't just blow. It roared with the memories of the gold rush, carrying the scent of salt, wet dog, and desperation. In a dimly lit tavern called the Rusty Anchor, the atmosphere was thick with tobacco smoke and the low hum of men trying to forget the war. Elias Thorne, now known as Eli Ward, a quiet carpenter with a limp, sat at the far end of the bar. He had traded his tailored OSS suits for flannel and grease-stained denim. Beside him, Anna, a woman the locals believed was his sister, cleaned a glass with practiced efficiency. Nina Petrova had traded her flight suit for an apron, but she still wore her hair tied back like a soldier, and her eyes never stayed on one thing for too long. There were ghosts living in plain sight. Another one, Eli? The bartender asked. Just water, Sam, Elias replied, his eyes fixed on the door. It was a habit he couldn't break. The bell above the door chimed, cutting through the low chatter. A man entered, draped in a heavy wool coat that looked too expensive for Alaska. He shook the snow off his shoulders and scanned the room with the precision of a predator. He didn't look like a miner or a fisherman. He looked like a man who counted secrets for a living. The stranger walked straight to the bar and sat down. He didn't order a drink. He placed a small, tarnished object on the wooden counter. It was a brass button, embossed with the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Air Force. Nina's hand froze on the glass she was cleaning. I'm looking for a pilot, the man said, his voice a smooth, mid-Atlantic baritone. Someone who knows how to fly without making a sound. Someone who might have seen something, Violet, in the north. Elias felt the weight of the pistol tucked into his waistband. You're a long way from home, friend. Most pilots around here fly mail, not mysteries. The man turned his head. It was Frank Sterling, Elias's former handler from the OSS. But his face was different, haunted. The world is getting smaller, Elias, Sterling whispered, leaning in so the other patrons couldn't hear. The Soviets didn't stop at the North Pole. They've found another spire. This one is in the Gobi Desert. And they've figured out how to turn it on. Nina stepped forward, her voice a low hiss. We burned the files. We destroyed the core. There shouldn't be anything left. Nature abhors a vacuum, Nina, Sterling said, using her real name. When you vented the magnetic pressure at the pole, you didn't just stop the engine. You signaled the others. The Earth is a circuit board, and you just flipped the master switch. The second shock. Sterling reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was a high-altitude surveillance shot, grainy and black and white. It showed a massive excavation site in Mongolia. But it wasn't the machinery that caught Nina's breath. In the center of the camp stood a man. He was looking directly up at the camera, a smirk on his face. It was Colonel Volkov. He hadn't just survived, he had climbed the ranks of a new, even more secretive division of the KGB. He's not working for Moscow anymore, Sterling said. He's working for the thing inside the spires. He calls it the voice of the silenced dot. Suddenly, the windows of the tavern rattled. A high-pitched whine, identical to the sound of the world engine, vibrated through the floorboards. The lights in the bar flickered and died. Outside, the aurora borealis didn't just glow, it screamed in a violent, pulsating green. They're searching for you, Sterling said, standing up. The magnetic signature of that crystal you took, it's like a flare in the dark. You can hide from men, but you can't hide from the Earth itself. Nina looked at Elias. The peace they had built over the last 6 months vanished in a heartbeat. The war wasn't over. It had simply moved from the ice to the sand. We need a plane, Nina said, her eyes flashing with the old fire of the 588th Regiment. I have a B-25 Mitchell waiting at the airfield, Sterling replied. But it's going to be a one-way trip. Elias grabbed his coat. It always is. The Gobi Ghosts. The B-25 Mitchell surged into the sky, its twin radial engines screaming against the Aleutian winds. Inside the belly of the beast, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the quiet tavern they had left behind. The plane was stripped of its armor and guns to make room for extra fuel bladders. It was a long-range Shadow, painted a matte midnight blue. We're crossing the international date line in 10 minutes, Elias shouted over the roar. He was hunched over a radio set that was emitting nothing but static, a rhythmic, pulsing hiss that sounded like a heartbeat. Nina sat in the pilot's seat, her hands light on the yoke. She wasn't just flying the plane, she was feeling the air. The violet crystal, now encased in a lead-line box bolted to the instrument panel, was vibrating. Every time it hummed, the plane's electrical system flared. The magnetic interference is getting worse, Nina noted. It's not just the radio, Elias. The vacuum tubes are glowing blue. The invisible wall. As they approached the Mongolian border, the sky changed. The sun didn't set, it seemed to be swallowed by a wall of dust that rose 40,000 feet into the air. This wasn't a natural sandstorm. It was a magnetic scallop, a phenomenon Elias had only read about in ancient Tibetan scrolls. The dust was suspended in midair by a massive electromagnetic field. If we fly into that, the friction will melt the skin off the wings, Sterling yelled from the navigator's station. I'm not flying into it, Nina said, her eyes fixed on a narrow rift in the dust wall. I'm going under it. She pushed the nose down. The B-25 plummeted toward the desert floor. The Gobi was a landscape of jagged red cliffs and shifting dunes that looked like frozen waves. At 200 feet above the ground, the heat began to rise. Look! Elias pointed. In the center of the desert, surrounded by a ring of black, glassified sand, was the second spire. It was larger than the one in the Arctic, a monolith of obsidian etched with the same pulsing runes. But here, the Germans weren't the ones digging. A massive Soviet labor camp had been erected, but the soldiers weren't guarding prisoners. They were guarding a machine that looked like a giant tuning fork, aimed directly at the spire. The voice of the silence. "There he is," Nina whispered. Below them, on a raised platform, Colonel Volkov stood. He wasn't wearing a coat despite the wind. He was bathed in the violet light of the spire. Beside him stood a group of men in dark robes, not soldiers, but something else. They were the Lamas of the Black Sun, an occult sect that had survived the purges by promising Stalin the keys to the universe. "They're not just mining energy," Elias realized, looking through his binoculars. "They're using the spire as an antenna. They're trying to talk to something." As if hearing him, the violet crystal in the cockpit shattered its lead casing. A beam of pure, coherent light shot through the windshield, connecting with the spire below. The B-25 dived uncontrollably. The controls turned to ice in Nina's hands. "The engine's dead!" Sterling screamed. But Nina didn't panic. This was her element. The silent glide. She used the heat rising from the desert floor to keep the wings level. They weren't flying anymore. They were being pulled toward the spire like a moth to a flame. "Elias, the documents! If we crash, you have to destroy them. I'm not letting you go this time, Nina!" Elias unbuckled his seatbelt and crawled forward, grabbing the manual override for the landing gear. The plane skidded across the glassified sand, the sound of metal on crystal screaming like a dying god. They came to a halt mere meters from the base of the spire. The door of the B-25 was ripped open. Not by wind, but by the soldiers. Colonel Volkov stepped forward, his face glowing with an eerie internal light. He didn't look angry. He looked relieved. "Welcome home, little witch," Volkov said, his voice echoing not from his throat, but inside their heads. "You brought the missing piece. The Earth is finally ready to speak." Behind Volkov, the spire began to unfold like a lotus flower, revealing a void that wasn't dark. It was filled with the stars of a galaxy that didn't exist on any human map. The celestial engine. The interior of the Gobi spire was not made of stone or metal. As Nina and Elias were marched inside by Volkov's silent guard, the walls seemed to ripple like liquid oil. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust, and the floor felt like walking on the surface of a drum. "Look at the architecture," Elias whispered, his scholar's mind momentarily overcoming his terror. "It's not built, it's grown. These aren't carvings, they're circuits." Volkov led them to a central chamber where the ceiling vanished into a swirling vortex of violet clouds. In the center stood a pedestal holding a jagged, pulsing shard that matched the one Nina had carried from the Arctic. "You think this is about war?" Volkov said, turning to face them. His eyes were no longer human. The pupils had elongated into vertical slits, reflecting the starlight from the void above. "You think Hitler wanted to conquer Europe, or Stalin wants the West? They are ants fighting over crumbs. This spire is a gateway. A way for the architects to return." "The architects?" Nina spat, her hand surreptitiously reaching for the small flare gun hidden in her boot. "You've turned your back on your people for a fairy tale." "Not a fairy tale, Nina. A broadcast." Volkov gestured to the robed llamas. They began a low-frequency chant that resonated with the violet shard. The air began to vibrate so violently that Nina felt the fillings in her teeth ache. The transdimensional map. Suddenly, the chamber transformed. The walls became transparent, revealing a three-dimensional map of the Earth. But it wasn't the Earth they knew. It showed a network of golden ley lines connecting dozens of spires buried under the oceans, the deserts, and the ice caps. "The Earth is a battery," Elias realized, stepping toward the projection. "And these spires are the electrodes. You're draining the planet's magnetic field to power that gateway." "Exactly," Volkov smiled. But the Arctic Spire was the regulator. When you destroyed it, you caused a surge. Now, the system is overheating. Unless we bridge the connection here, in the Gobi, the Earth's core will solidify. The atmosphere will strip away. We won't just lose the war, we'll lose the world. He's lying, Sterling hissed from behind them. He's trying to justify the ritual. I am not, Volkov replied calmly. I am the only one who can hear them. The voice in the silence. They are coming to save us from ourselves. They will bring order to the chaos of humanity. The 0-hour choice. The spire began to pulse with a blinding white light. Outside, the B-25 Mitchell was being dragged toward the monolith by an irresistible magnetic pull. The metal was glowing cherry red. Nina! Elias grabbed her arm. If he completes the sequence, the gateway opens, but the planet's magnetic shield collapses. We'll be fried by solar radiation before his architects even get here. Nina looked at the violet shard on the pedestal. It was the key. If I can't fly a plane out of here, I'll fly the energy, Nina whispered. She didn't reach for her gun. Instead, she sprinted toward the pedestal. The silent guards raised their weapons, but Volkov waved them back, curious. Nina didn't grab the shard. She grabbed the lead-lined box Elias had used to carry their fragment. She slammed it down over the pulsing shard, breaking the line of sight between the two crystals. The reaction was instantaneous. The golden ley lines on the map turned blood red. The vortex above began to scream, a sound of tearing metal and cosmic fury. What have you done? Volkov shrieked, his composure shattering. I broke the circuit, Nina yelled over the roar. Elias, the explosives! Elias didn't hesitate. He threw his final satchel of TNT into the base of the cooling conduit. The great collapse. The explosion was small, but in a room filled with unstable magnetic energy, it was a spark in a powder keg. The floor tilted. The liquid walls began to harden and crack. Go! To the plane! Nina commanded. They sprinted through the collapsing corridors. Behind them, Volkov was laughing, a high, shrill sound. He wasn't trying to escape. He was embracing the spire as it began to implode. They reached the B-25 just as the magnetic pull reversed, pushing them away from the spire with violent force. Nina scrambled into the pilot's seat. The engines, dead only moments ago, roared to life as the surge of energy jump-started the starters. We're going to be caught in the vacuum, Sterling yelled. Not today! Nina pulled the yoke back with everything she had. The B-25 shot away from the Gobi spire just as the monolith collapsed into a singularity of violet light. A shockwave hit them, flipping the bomber onto its side, but Nina held it. She looked back to see the desert floor swallowing the site, leaving nothing but a massive, glass-lined crater. Aftermath, the Silent Covenant. Hours later, flying over the Pacific under a sky that had finally returned to its natural hue, the three of them sat in silence. It's not over, is it? Elias asked, looking at the empty lead box. No, Nina said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. There are other spires. Other Volkovs. But now we know how to fight them. Sterling looked at his two rogues, the American spy and the Soviet witch. The government is going to hunt you forever for this. Let them, Nina said, banking the plane toward a hidden airfield in the Philippines. They're looking for soldiers. They aren't ready to fight ghosts. The Long Watch. Cape Canaveral, Florida, July 16, 1969. The air was thick with the scent of salt spray and the electric hum of anticipation. Thousands of people lined the beaches, their eyes turned toward the white needle of the Saturn V rocket shimmering in the heat haze. Among the spectators sat an elderly couple in a rusted turquoise Chevrolet. The man, Elias, had hair the color of the Arctic snow he had once survived, and his hands, though wrinkled, still held a pen with the precision of a master cartographer. The woman, Nina, wore dark sunglasses, but the way she watched the sky, head tilted, catching the rhythm of the wind, betrayed the soul of a pilot. They have no idea what they're knocking on, do they? Elias whispered, tapping a morning newspaper featuring the Apollo 11 crew. They think they are explorers, Nina replied, her voice still carrying the faint, melodic rasp of her youth. They don't realize they are just returning the signal. The echo in the bones. Since the Gobi implosion in '46, Nina and Elias had lived a life of shadows. They had changed their names 5 times, worked as bush pilots in the Andes, and archivists in London. They had spent decades tracking the static, the subtle magnetic fluctuations that occurred every time humanity made a leap in aerospace technology. They knew the truth that the CIA and KGB were still desperately trying to piece together. The spires weren't weapons of war. They were Earth's long-range acoustic mirrors. I checked the readings this morning, Elias said, pulling a small, handheld device from his pocket, a modified Geiger counter he'd built using parts from a crashed U-2 spy plane. The needle was vibrating rhythmically. The moment that rocket breaks the upper atmosphere, it's going to trigger the resonance. The remaining spires, they're waking up. Ignition. A low rumble began, a sound felt more in the chest than heard in the ears. The Saturn V roared to life, a pillar of fire lifting the hopes of a generation toward the moon. To the world, it was the triumph of democracy and science. To Nina and Elias, it was a flare launched into a dark forest. As the rocket pierced the clouds, Nina felt a familiar tingle in her fingertips. The violet light, the same shade as the Gobi spire, flickered deep within the exhaust plume for a fraction of a second. There, Nina pointed. The handshake. It's not just a moon landing, Nina, Elias said, his voice trembling. The architects, they aren't coming back to Earth. They've been waiting outside the door. We just handed them the key. The final flight. That night, back at their small cottage on the Florida coast, Nina sat at an old shortwave radio. She tuned the dial past the news reports, past the music, until she hit the dead space between stations. This silence was no longer silent. A series of pulses, mathematical, cold, and ancient, began to flow through the speaker. It was a sequence they had first heard in the Arctic and felt in the Gobi. But this time, it was coming from the direction of the moon. What does it say? Elias asked, leaning over her shoulder. Nina closed her eyes, visualizing the sky she had once ruled in a wooden biplane. She translated the pulses, the rhythm of the witch's glide. The circuit is complete. The guardians are resting. The harvest begins. Nina looked at Elias. They were old now, their war long forgotten by a world obsessed with television and plastic. The night witches were a footnote in history books. The OSS was a ghost of the past. We did our part, Elias, Nina said, switching off the radio. We gave humanity 25 years of peace they didn't know they bought. Is it enough? Nina stood up and walked to the window, looking up at the pale silver orb of the moon. Somewhere up there, 3 men were carrying the weight of a world that was about to change forever. It has to be, she said. She reached into her jewelry box and pulled out a tiny, dull fragment of violet stone, the very last piece of the world engine. It no longer glowed. It was cold. The stars are calling, Elias. And this time, they aren't using a whisper. She opened the window and tossed the stone into the dark Atlantic waves. As it hit the water, a final, faint ripple of violet light spread across the surface, then vanished into the deep. The silent war was over. The cosmic war had just begun.